Hello, this is Hugo Prévost, and you are listening to SVGA, your PC retro gaming podcast. With me, as always, is Robert Hiltz. Hello, Robert.
Hello, Hugo. How are you?
I'm fine. I'm really glad to talk to you again. It's been a while.
It certainly has. Yeah, it's been a while since we've done this, but it's nice to be back.
Yeah, it is indeed. If you remember correctly, I'm talking to our listeners right now. Our last episode was a solo one, so was there criticizing, talking about one of my favorite games, The Last Express. But today we are not talking. Well, we're talking about a game, but it's more a movie about a game. So, what are we talking about this week, Robert?
This week we are talking about Lemmings, the Can You Dig It, the 30th anniversary, basically documentary about how the game was made and sort of the impact it had.
Exactly. Lemmings, maybe for the people who were too young to remember, Lemmings is a puzzle game that came out in 1991, developed by Psygnosis, a British studio, and developed for the Amiga. So if you want to have if you want to have information about a game that is a bit old, talk about a platform that doesn't exist anymore. That's going to be your cue. So
yeah.
And this movie came out late last year, and I don't think
I don't think it's in wide release yet, but yeah, there was a they did a sort of panel and a viewing, and we managed to get our grubby little hands on a copy of the documentary. We asked, and they said, "Sure, here's a screener."
Yeah, exactly.
We didn't steal it.
No. And so we watched it. I think you watched a part of it, and that's going to be part of our discussion today.
Unfortunately, I wasn't able to finish. Well, yeah. So I watched. I made it. I was able to do about half of it. I've been very busy lately, but there's some reasons that I also didn't finish.
Yeah. I mean, let's get right into it. It's 2 hours long.
It's a very long film.
It's
and
a very long
unfortunately,
film.
I do feel bad about not getting through about and talking about it, but at the same time, these things happen.
Yeah, they do, and it's once again, yes, of course you're busy, but it's once again a point of the movie being too long, in my opinion. I mean, we'll get to that a bit later, I think. And so, the movie talks about the creation of the game, of course, and everything that came before, everything that came, lots of stuff that came after the influence of the game on the entire video game industry, the way that some puzzle games were developed afterwards, and I think one of the most interesting aspect, there we go, of the movie is the way that they talk about the state of the industry at the time. And as I said, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say that this was, so I've seen the first half of the movie, which is really kind of on how they came to, get to the game and so forth. And what really stuck out to me is how, looking at today where big, huge titles, they're studios with people who've been doing this forever. And these were just, a lot of them were just a bunch of guys from a computer club that just tried some stuff and eventually got to this idea. And while it took a very long time, it was a really interesting look at how just really unrecognizable the video games industry then is compared to now. It wasn't really an industry so much as a series of hobbyists making money kind of thing.
Exactly. And there's a long part of the movie talking about, like you said, the computer, really nerds at that point was I think the term that was used. Computer hobbyists, they met in a computer club where they each had to bring up their own machines, and it was really the time where machines were a big gray or beige box, and you have to plug in a TV or something like that. And yeah, they went on to develop one of the most, maybe not one of the most known games, not today, I think, but I believe that if you most people will know what Lemmings is.
Mm-hmm.
And even if there hasn't been really a sequel for almost 10, 15 years now, at
That's a
least.
very good question. It's been quite a while.
I mean, the part that you didn't see in the movie was that at the end they talk about there's a mobile version now, and I cringed a bit at that point because, well, it's the spirit of the game, but not the essence. If you know what I mean. I mean, basically, what Lemming is, I think we can start there. If you haven't played the game, like I said, there's a puzzle game. You have a bunch of characters called Lemmings, not the rodents, of course, but small humanoid people. And you have to take them from point A to point B, from the entrance to the exit of the level. And basically, the concept was this level is you can transform it. Also, you have a bunch of different tasks that you can assign to the Lemmings.
And essentially, the Lemmings, in the way like the creatures, at least in myth, that they will walk forward into anything. That they will follow each other, off a cliff into the fire or just into a wall and back again. And the goal of the game is to, dig through a wall, build a bridge over a chasm, put someone to stop people from running over the edge to get them to the exit safely, because they're not going to do it on their own.
Yeah, exactly. And at the time, it was something really, really special. What wasn't something that existed in 1991, of course. It was, I think, taking advantage of technologies that were maybe not as used as today as they are today. I mean, of course, you needed a mouse to play the game.
Mm-hmm.
Today, it's obvious that you usually need a mouse on the PC to play a video game. But at the time, it was mostly, for example, if you took shooting games, you use the arrow keys and
maybe a joystick.
And then so they came out with a way to, like Microsoft use Solitaire to get people to practice them using a mouse. That's basically the same way they did it at Psygnosis in 1991.
Mm-hmm. Which is really interesting to think of, like using a mouse being in some way revolutionary in a game, but it they used to be able to really navigate without ever touching a mouse. I mean, I don't know how many of our listeners had experience using DOS, but I remember, before we had, at least in my house, before we had Windows 3.1, you did everything through DOS, and a mouse really never came into it.
Yeah. I never really used DOS. Our first family computer was Windows 95. So
okay, yeah. Because when we got Windows 3.1, I remember my dad. It took a whole afternoon of just like there were like 12 floppy disks or something ridiculous, and it just took all day to install. But it was. No, we had. So at the time I played Lemmings, it would have likely been on DOS.
Yeah. But still, you needed to use, like I said, you needed to use the mouse.
Mm-hmm.
It was too, and today the term doesn't really apply, but at the time it was too precise. You need really to be precise, and so using just the arrow keys was out of the question. And so the movie is really taking its time to get to the point, but that's that's another thing completely.
There's a theme here.
But it really explains. I think that's what is the most interesting, once again, point of the movie. It really explains how this came to be, and it's a period of time, because today you think about game development, you think about the US, maybe Canada or Quebec a bit. If you're living here, and you every time in the media something comes out, it's like, oh, it's Ubisoft Montreal or Square Enix Sherbrooke or whatever. But yeah, at the time, the British scene was really something to see. They had their own lines of computers. They had their own way of developing stuff, including games. And so to see this in action, to see, of course, that four or five guys could work together to put out this kind of huge success.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, today there's indie games, but I don't think you could have, in that sense, you could have a team of 5 people putting out something like Lemmings, and to be able to, with an indie game, be so successful on the first day, maybe.
No, and it's interesting the way that, there's the Lemmings Christmas edition, and that sort of like there's just all sorts of things that just don't exist. But it is interesting how, no one would think of Dundee, Scotland now as some sort of tech hub, but it was. And it's funny because part of it turned out to be because they had a Texas Instruments, I think it was Texas, or there was a plant that made calculators or something. And one thing they made were these crummy little computers.
Yeah.
That just because they were made in the town, there were so many of them that people would just have them. And, when enough people had computers, it was just, that became a hobby for people. And because it became a hobby for certain people to play stuff, others wanted to make stuff. And then from there, you have this. Whereas now it's a whole industry, and there's, university courses and internships and yada, yada.
Yeah. I think you saw this, there's a whole bit about how they use about a space of 8 by 10 pixels to do the animation for the characters. Mm-hmm. And what did you think about this part of the movie?
Well, it's fascinating to think of the sort of the limits that were sort of imposed on them just by the nature of, like, that's where graphics were. And actually, if any of the listeners, if you just go to the Wikipedia page, they have an interesting a GIF of the walking motion. And
you said GIF, Robert. Come on.
We're not doing that. We're not doing it. There's an interesting animated image.
Yeah, there you go.
That kind of shows you the original and then the sort of updated version of just what the lemming walking looks like. Yeah. And you can really see in the basic, like, one of them, it just kind of moves up and down and the legs move and you can sort of see an arm swinging. And then the second one, it's just, there's this jauntier motion. The hair flips a bit with just a pixel moving around.
Yeah.
And it's really fascinating to see the sort of something so subtle as just like a blue pixel moving from the back of a head to the front in a rhythm is like, oh yeah, that's hair, and it's moving, like, and how expressive that is, despite it being, it's 8 by 10.
Yeah, and there's a bit, I have it right there my second screen right now, and there's also a bit with I think the shoes. There's a bit of the shoes that goes higher than, and it's really enhanced the walking animation. And like you said, it's incredible to see, because today, of course, and it's all games, of course, but today, if you think about a big game, you have this photorealistic stuff.
Mm-hmm. You've got motion capture.
You have millions of polygons and
ray tracing, and you've got shaders, and there's all that going on.
And then 30 years ago, it was 8 by 10 pixels, and it was enough. And when I think about Lemmings, I think about the original game, and like you said, there's been some expansion. There's been, I think, a 3D version that came out eventually in the 90s. But if you go back to the basic principle of solving a puzzle, you don't necessarily need extensive 3D graphics. You don't need 3D graphics at all. And for me, it's really interesting to see how far we've come since then, but how little you need to have a good game.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really, I mean, we've played a game called Faith on the podcast before.
Yes.
And it was a Halloween horror team game, and it's basically an homage to the graphics of the Atari era. And
yeah, we're talking like 16 colors.
Yeah,
very basic.
And yeah, extremely basic, but it is extremely efficient too. Mm-hmm. And I'm not saying that I don't want to play the latest Call of Duty or a really, really beautiful game. I mean, I'm really happy to do that. But, and I'm looking forward to a bunch of new games that are coming out this year, like Homeworld 3. And I really like to have big, beautiful graphics and explosions and fighters and capital ships and whatever. But seeing this movie is a way to end. Basically, talking to you for this podcast is a way to remember that it's not only the graphics that count.
Yeah, because there was a time where I used to be really impressed by graphics and effects, and that sort of like, oh wow, look at what they're able to do. And now the difference between kind of good and really good is like it's there, and if you're playing something in 4K at 120 hertz, like it's different than 1080p, and it's just a little below 60 frames or whatever. Like there's a difference there, but it's not as impressive as it used to be. Sometimes it adds to things, but sometimes it's just like, okay, but maybe you could have just spent some more time on storytelling or level development or that kind of thing. And it's interesting to see. I'm always kind of fascinated doing this podcast and just doing things generally. Like I take pictures with a film camera because I like the idea of limitations being input. Like when things are limitless, like just because you can do something doesn't mean doing that thing is good or enjoyable. It can be really, unenjoyable and kind of just too many things thrown at you at once. Whereas Lemmings is pretty simple in the way that the graphics are straightforward. They do the job. They give you enough that your brain is like, oh, I know what that is, but it's not, overwhelming you. But at the same time, the mechanics of the game are so interesting that it's a puzzle game, but it's also a puzzle game that's, there's not a timer on it, but you have these lemmings that keep falling out of the sky, and you have to get a certain amount safely, and you have to work quickly and accurately, and you have to really think it through. And there's a lot to be said for, something simple and straightforward, that is in some ways, at the time was very graphically pleasing, but it wasn't just about that.
Yeah, you're right. And it's really interesting that you talk about limitations. I don't know if you've seen the Archive 81 series on Netflix.
I have not, actually.
Okay, well, I won't go over the story in its entirety, but basically it is the story of a guy that has to restore videotapes from the 90s to solve a mystery. And he's, let's say, an old tech geek, and he really likes to collect VHS tapes and audio tapes and old movies from the 30s and the 40s, and we both like old stuff. I mean, basically that's why we're here right now. But to be able to see is the physicality. I think that comes into play here, and it's the reasons why, for example, I collect old PC games. It's not only to say, oh, I have the game. I could have the game on the with zeros and ones on a hard drive. It will be, it wouldn't be the same. It's having the manual, having the disc, and coming back to Lemmings, it's really, and that's, as I said, interesting in the movie is like, okay, here we had, they talk about how they had 4 computers in a small cramped room over a restaurant, and they just created their stuff there. And it's not, I'm sure there's something fascinating about creating a game at Ubisoft, for example, but you have 500 people working on it, 1,000 people working on it. And so when you create, when you're the one person that creates an entire game compared to you're one of 1,000 people working on how the cape's going to flow in the wind.
Yeah, or how the, like doing textures on the trash that fills the sort of edge of the screen or whatever.
Yeah. So I don't want to say that their work is not important, but it's a way that I was watching the movie and I was feeling connected. I was feeling that these people were connected to the product, more connected than maybe someone who, like you said, working on the textures for a wall that you're going to see for half a second. And that's maybe where modern games can be a bit dull sometimes.
Yeah, or if not dull, that they, in some ways, they have their own limitations that, people are expecting a certain thing, or there's a certain, it's like after you saw Grand Theft Auto, how many games came out afterwards that were like Grand Theft Auto, or that open world thing, like, oh, well, this is where, there was a time where there's no real precursor to Lemmings, not like in a play style, right? Like I can't think of or really since, like this is just sort of a self-contained kind of, when you think about a really strange idea, but really interesting.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's time now to talk about the less interesting aspects of the movie. I think we've said it before. It's at 2 hours. It's really too long. And it's not that it's not interesting, but the way that it's presented. Because usually when you watch a documentary, there's some narration, there's some music, there's some nice you try to have some nice transitions. You can also go the entire different route and have something like a live documentary where you just follow someone and stuff happens. But when you go to the historical route to present stuff that happened before and to try to summarize historical events, I think the best way is to have someone, like I said, doing the narration, have some music, have some transition, and there is almost nothing.
Yeah, I mean, it can certainly be done, but it can certainly be done, but I think the difficulty is that it has to be done in the right way. Like you can tell a story through interviews alone, and sometimes it works, but sometimes, I think there's a lot of interesting color and background and stuff about how these guys got together and, how they built up to building, what was like a just massive selling game or whatever. But at the same time, it takes a long time to get there, and there was a way to tell this story that, wouldn't require 2 hours.
Yeah, exactly. And I think maybe for people that are really, really, really passionate about British software from the 90s, or the tech scene in Scotland or in Britain at the time. Maybe they're going to find this extremely interesting because there's a lot of details, a lot of interviews. They get, of course, about everyone that worked on the game or were friends with people that were working at the game at the time, etc. And so it really delves into the details. But
Mhm.
if you're not, I mean, it gets to a point where I was starting to twiddle my thumbs a bit.
Mhm. And I'll say that, I mean, part of the reason I couldn't get to this movie was it was very long, but I mean, another part of it is just it's a fantastically busy time for me, and it's not entirely the movie's fault. Part of that is on me, so I do, some of my judgment did take with a grain of salt, but I did feel at times, like in the first half of the film, it's like, okay, this is all interesting, but like we don't need to hear each person's perspective on every meeting of the computer club. Like one guy's like, yeah, we met at the computer club, it was fun, we were kind of nerds. Like, all right, let's go.
Yeah, exactly. But still, it's, as I said, it's interesting. It's an interesting perspective on the industry at the time. I think we can give it that to them.
Oh, definitely. And I think it, if you've got the time and when it does come in a wider release, I think it is actually still worth looking at and seeing, hey, you got it, but maybe at certain points you speed it up to 1.5 times or something. I can't really watch things that way. It's like that's a bit much for me, but at the same time, there's a lot of it's interesting to see how these things were made because it was a very different time and just with very different philosophies and hardware and all kinds of things that still make it interesting.
Absolutely. Can we still play? Because I've looked around a bit, and there doesn't seem to be a way to buy the game these days. And of course, if you don't try to track down a physical copy, but in that sense, you'll need to find a suitable computer, and that's another all kind of worms. But yeah, I don't think it's anywhere. It's besides, well, you can play it in a browser. I think I've sent you a link
I played it
days back.
I played it with one of these sort of online browser things, but I haven't seen it somewhere where you can actually play it offline.
Yeah, and I think it would benefit from getting I don't know what the situation is with the rights holder and so on. But yeah, it's one of those games that you think it's so iconic that iconic. It's so well known. Let's go with that. Because I mean, I don't think I've ever really played Lemmings. I've seen
really?
The
You've
game.
Never that's interesting. Okay, because I actually played Lemmings.
But what I wanted to say was that even if I didn't really play the game myself, I think I've seen it once at a friend's house on a Saturday morning.
Right. Okay.
But it's there. It's like a cultural reference. It's like saying the Skyrim joke about the arrow in the knee, or some reference to Star Wars or something else. It's there, and of course, it's not as universal as Star Wars, of course, but it's, if you are a fan of old-ish video games, it's what Lemmings is, what the type of game is, the animation, the walking animation of the character, and so on and so on. So I think it's a bit sad that there's no real way to find this again and to be able to play it in that way.
Yeah, no, I think that's right, and it's too bad because it's a fun game.
Well, I'm gonna believe you on this. I have no idea. I mean, I can guess that it's challenging and interesting, and can indeed be fun. But maybe one day I'll give it a go and take the plunge, as they say.
Yeah. I mean, good luck, because I remember as a kid, like you got to a point where it was like, no, this is too difficult. I can't handle it. So I don't think it's a game that I ever beat, but it was a game that, you'd play for a while and then you'd get either frustrated or bored with, because, you're a child.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's worth it just because there's really not anything quite like it.
Yeah. I think there was a 2-player mode.
Yes,
at the time when it came out. Well, that's what it says. I think that's what they said in the documentary. That's on the wiki. And the funny thing was, in the movie, they said, "Oh well, we did a multiplayer aspect, but you needed 2 mice to be able to play it with 2 people." And so 2 mice plug into one computer. And someone said in the movie, "Well, at the time, almost nobody had 2 mice." And so they went a bit overboard with this, I think. And they said, "Oh,
yeah.
we can do it, but is it useful? I don't know. It's there."
Yeah, I don't think I ever owned 2 mice at once, or at least not 2 working mice.
Yeah, I know what you mean. Well, Robert, thank you very much for being here with me today. I don't think I've mentioned it. This is episode 14, of course, of SVGA. I don't remember if I said it at the beginning of the episode. Anyway, thank you very much for being here with me once again. Always nice to talk to you, and we'll try. I know these days it's quite busy for both of us, but we'll try to get back to you, our listeners, with some new stuff sooner than 3 months.
It's been a while.
It's been a while. If you want to catch up on previous episode, of course, everything is on pieuvre.ca. You can also find us on Apple Podcast, on Google Podcast, on Spotify, and with our host, Balado Québec. And I'm proud to announce that we are going to have some merch soonish. Let's go with soonish.
Soonish is good.
We are in the process of redesigning our logo. So when everything is done, you'll be able to get your hands on a nice coffee cup with our brand new branding. So that's going to be interesting to follow. So stay tuned, and talk to you soon.
Bye, Hugo. It's fun.